values. Not everybody shares your values. Not everybody understands your God. You ever wonder why Paul didn't tell us what he prayed for? 3 times I prayed, God, take this horrible thing from me. I call it a messenger of Satan. It buffets me. It beats me down. It keeps me from having pride and dignity. Lest I be exalted, there's that thing. Please, God, you can take it out of my life. 3 times he prayed. What was it? Nobody knows. He never told us. Oh, there's a handful of people who think, I believe he was probably going blind. Well, good for you. You believe something. That's nice. There's a couple of people say, I think Paul was hunchback. Have you ever read that? Why do you think that? Well, I don't know. I saw whatever. Now, you don't know anything. You know nothing. And you know nothing because Paul didn't tell. Now, not that he thought we were swine. Somebody would have been. I have read verses to people who were going through something in their life, and I've taken a verse and I've said, here's what Jesus said about it. And I get through reading the verse and they'll say, well, I know, but I don't believe that. Oh, okay. I don't know why you came to me to ask me a question, because the only thing I know is the Bible, and it's the only thing I believe really matters of any value. So I just don't believe that. Somebody jumped on a public figure just a few years ago in the pandemic because of something a public figure said about God during the pandemic, about God healing and what have you. And they just jumped all over that public figure because they didn't think that anybody in this pandemic of fear should be just cavalierly throwing out God like he's an antidote to anything. What? He's not an antidote. People shouldn't be led to believe they can ask God for help during this time. Are you out of your mind? Well, no, that's just what they believe. So if you read them a verse saying, well, here's what the Bible says, you know what's going to happen? They're going to mock it. You're not going to convert them. They don't have any appreciation for that pearl that you believe in and you cling to, so you know what they're going to do. They're going to do the same thing a pig would do. They're just going to wallow on it for a little while. Try to bite it, no good. Nah, not for me. I know what I'll do. I'll just mix it in with the mud I live in, find a way to dilute it, make it mean nothing. When you reveal the thing that could have made you bitter, you have exposed someone else's weakness, and you have still revealed that you were hurt. And instead, you ought to only talk about the grace of God as Paul did, and not about your source of bitterness. If I confess to you that something happened to me, I did something, I went through this, but oh, look, the grace of God has helped me and I'm up above it, and you're going through something very similar, you know what you'll most likely do? You'll think, I'm making a comparison between me and you. And I said, God did this for me. And you're like, well, I guess he thinks I'm not as close to God as he is because God hadn't done that for me. So I don't tell you much about anything. You've heard me say my mantra, one of my favorite mantras is surely the goodness and mercy of God will follow me all the days of my life. I live believing goodness and mercy follows me all the days of my life. I live that way. I think it's true. I capture it from Psalm 23. I think that's what I like it. The reason I hang on to that is because David wrote it, and David was a horrible man. I don't believe goodness and mercy of God follows me because I got it figured out and I'm a righteous dude. I like it because the guy who wrote that phrase in the Old Testament was an adulterer, a murderer, covered up his sin, covered up his murder, lied through his teeth, got a woman pregnant. Horrible dude, King David. Until the preacher put his finger at him, told him a story about a man with one little lamb, and David got all incensed. I want to fix that man that stole another man's lamb. Where is he? And the prophet said, you, David, it's you I'm talking about. You took another man's wife. You did it. And David could have had the prophet executed and nobody would have ever known. But instead, David, for the first time, saw himself through the eyes of God. The prophet revealed, this is what God knows about you. And David humbled himself and repented. And did you know there's no other character in the Old Testament of whom God said, that's a man after my own heart? And he said that of David. A man after my own heart. Because David was perfect? No, because David owned up to his sins and failures and still came back to a position of believing that God would let goodness and mercy follow him all the days of his life. Now that takes some courage and faith right there, to believe the grace of God is so rich and so full, and God's mercy is so abundant that God would have it on a horrible human being, to the extent that once you repented and came clean, God would say, goodness and mercy are going to follow you all the days of your life. I like that. I believe that. And so once in a while, something happens to me that I just think is probably phenomenal. And I'm scared to tell anybody about it. It goes between me and God for the most part. Because I think, you know what, if I tell them, oh, they just had a similar experience recently, then theirs ended in disaster. And if I just say, you know, I think God did this for me. You see on the screen, I'm exposing somebody else's anger toward God. Well, I went through it. And I didn't have the same result. What are you trying to say? See, I saw this about human nature in my first pastorate. Founded a church in 1973, and I was 23 years old. And after we had moved from our little Rotary Club building to two storefronts on the square across from the courthouse, and then we moved into a large old Baptist church building that they had moved on when they built a new one. We got to move in that one. And then we got 2 acres on a corner lot, an old house, and we gutted it and remodeled it into a little auditorium and a couple of rooms and bathrooms. And I'm preaching one day, and this guy walks in the back door of our church. I'm already preaching the sermon, and he walks in the back door, and about 5 minutes after he sits down, I'm just in the middle of a sermon like this, and you know how y'all are sitting here looking, is it lunchtime? Yeah, pretty close. Well, this dude walked in and sat on the back, and all of a sudden he's just back there like this, quiet, but he's bawling. All I see is this, man. And so as soon as the church is over, dismissed, I want to go get him. He's gone. He's out the door driving out of the parking lot. And so I told some of the ushers, if that guy comes again, somebody catch him, find out what the deal is. He's crying the whole service. I like people that cry when I preach. Wait, that sounds wrong too. Never mind. I like people I can tell believe in something I'm saying. And this dude came the next Sunday, sat down. After I'm preaching, he walks in, sits down, and I don't remember at all what I'm preaching, and he just starts crying. And he gets up, and I'm like, I want these ushers to get this dude. Well, he finally stayed, I think the 3rd time he came. And he asked me after church, could you meet me for breakfast tomorrow? So I met him at a McDonald's or somewhere the next morning, Monday, for breakfast. And I'll give you the shortest version of his story I can give you. Turns out he said, you know, years ago I had an experience with God. I really felt like God just came into my truck. And I have been looking for that feeling, that Spirit of God ever since. And I hadn't found it. I don't go to church. I visit now and then. And then I walked in here just out of curiosity a couple of weeks ago, and I walked in, sat on the back, and after I sat down on the back row, I'm sorry, preacher, but I don't know what you were saying or preaching, because he sat down beside me. The same God that appeared to me in my truck, that sat down beside me, and I felt his presence. And I'm like, well, I'm flattered that he felt the presence of God in my church, but it apparently had nothing to do with my sermon. So I'm curious, and then he starts telling me this story, and here's his story. He was a truck driver, a regular route all the time. And he pulled into his truck stop one morning a good ways back, and the waitress in there that they always flirt back and forth flirted with him, and this time the flirting took on a different nature. He's a married man with a kid, but this woman was flirting, and he was lonely and miserable, because wives can do that to men. Not y'all. No, I'm just talking about him. That's what he... And he said, I don't know what it was, preacher, but For the first time, I've never cheated on my wife. For the first time, I said to her, okay, when I come back through, we'll meet. We'll go down to the hotel. I'll tell my wife I'm still gone for another day, and we'll meet at the hotel, and we'll have a rendezvous. And he said, but I knew better. And as soon as I pulled my truck out on the service road to go U-turn under it and get on my run, I just thought, my God, why did I do that? Why did I tell her that? Why? Well, what will I even do? My wife doesn't deserve this. I don't know, God, why I did that. And he said, I don't even go to church, and I'm just telling God I'm sorry. And I pull up on the ramp, and finally a truck, my car lets me in. I get up on the freeway. It's my regular run. I look at the sign. I'm 45 miles to wherever, and something no longer than that, long run. But he looks at the sign, familiar route, and he said, all of a sudden on that road, there was a blinding light right in front of my cab, just a huge bright light. I couldn't see anything, just bright light. And he said, and so I don't know how to respond. It's just I reached for the brake, and all of a sudden that bright light is in my cab. And I know it's Jesus. And I never saw anything except blinding light. Sound familiar from the New Testament? Saul, Book of Acts, Saul. And he said, I have this blinding light. And he said, preacher, I'm telling you, God came in that cab. He told me he knew my heart. He knew that I was sorry for what I'd planned to do, that I was going to just skip it and not go there and not do anything. But he told me all the secrets of my life and my past and showed me the path that I'd been following and where it needed to go. And he said, when he was through, my heart was changed. I said, I'm sorry, I love you, God, I've got to serve you. And I knew when he disappeared, that was like a flash, a blink of an eye. Oh my God. I grabbed the steering wheel. My truck is still hurling down the road. And I'm just crying, bawling like a baby. I'm saying, I'm going to serve you, God. I'm going to serve you, God. And he said a road sign was coming up, and I looked at it. And that particular sign was 45 miles from where I'd gotten on the road, my regular run. I had spent a second in the presence of God, and I had driven my truck for 45 miles. At that point, you know what the preacher thought? Sitting in McDonald's at breakfast with a man, I thought, oh, great. A cuckoo. I thought it was a potential church member. I thought, yay, somebody who has a sensitive heart. And now he's a cuckoo. I was 23 years old, pastoring my first church. You know why I thought he was a cuckoo? Because nothing like that ever happened to me. And I've had some awesome experiences with God. In Vietnam, I had two that were unbelievable to anybody but me and God. And now, because I hadn't had his kind of experience, really, he drove 45 miles in a blinding light and thought it was a couple of minutes? Really? And it was difficult for me to embrace that. Now, I hope you take this with a grain of salt today. I don't mean that he shouldn't have told me, but I will tell you, in that exchange, I was the swine. He had a pearl. A great thing had happened to him. And he pitched it out for me to hear and see. And I didn't know how to value that God had really done that for him. To really believe that such miraculous things could happen. The wonderful climax to that story is his boy was in high school, and he started coming to church. I got to baptize him and his son, his wife. And then a year later or less, a little less than a year later, his son went to school with a headache, and one of the boys said, here, I got an aspirin from home. Only it wasn't an aspirin, it was a Valium he had stolen out of his mother's medicine chest. By the time he got to Body Shop, the boys were all making sport of him behind his back. He didn't know it was all funny to them. They didn't know how many Valiums he had taken, but he was out of his mind and drunk, and they were hiding him from teachers, and they got into Body Shop. And he said, I'm weird. I don't know. And one of them said, well, you need some orange juice, and just held up a little vial of acid, thinking that that was a joke. He was just being funny. There's a vial of battery acid or something in there. And before they realized it, he just grabbed it and threw it down his throat. And the minute he did, he starts bleeding and hemorrhaging, and he collapses on the floor. And they have to call an ambulance, and they get an ambulance, and they get him to, I think, Garland Hospital. And then I get a phone call later. The boy is unconscious. They can't pump his stomach. They found out they think he took anywhere from 12 to 14 Valiums. They don't know how many. They need to get it out of him, and they can't get it out of him because his throat and the back of his throat and his esophagus all deteriorated from the acid. He's a goner. He's unconscious, and they're glad he is, because he would probably tear at anything they've got on him. They didn't have a tube in him. They couldn't put it in there. They're literally trying to counter with another drug, the drug that he has taken, the Valium. And they gave the dad, 12 hours, maybe we'll know something in 12 hours. No change. That came in, the dad's putting stock in that 12 hours. They're just buying time. 12 more hours. And that came 24 hours later. Well, look, we're just waiting on 12 hours. 36 hours later, he hasn't changed. And they're preparing the dad for death. The boy, the bleeding, we can't siphon him out because we'll tear everything the acid has destroyed. And so they were trying other means to get fluid out of his body, going in here and what have you. And the dad called me, and I'd been to the hospital a time or two, and this big old truck driver got me in the room. A couple of nurses hardly ever left. And the dad, the man now who claimed this bright light came in his truck. And he sat down by him in my church and let him ignore my sermon. And his dad says, "Pastor, would you just get on that side of the bed and me on this side and kneel down and just reach our arms across?" And that, there's no scripture for that. That's just a broken-hearted dad, and I'm going to do whatever. And I said, absolutely. So I get down on my knees, and he gets on his, and we reach over his big old masculine truck-driving arm, and my skinny golfing arm reached out. And I'm really just, I don't know, there's no verse I can stand on. I'm just on a man's hope. And he prayed, "God, please save my boy, heal him, get him up. You didn't bring us this far, let us go," and all this kind of stuff. And nothing happened. We prayed, we got up, nurses are crying, we're crying. I hugged him, I said goodbye. And I'm figuring, pastor, preacher of faith and optimism, and I'm figuring the next call I get, he'll be dead. And sure enough, a couple hours later, phone rings, and I grab it. And he's saying, you need to come to the hospital. An amazing thing happened. Daddy was asleep in the chair, and the nurse was looking at the monitors, and somebody behind her said, "I'm hungry." And she turned to see who'd come in the room. Nobody's in the room. She looked, the boy's looking at her. The boy who couldn't talk, who they'd said his vocal cords are going to be destroyed if he lives, and can't do anything for him, is looking at her, and she said, "What?" And he said, "I'm hungry." And she screams and runs down the hallway to get the doctor. That's how they knew he was a goner. And he had never talked, probably because the acid had eaten him, destroyed him. She runs down the hallway. The doctor happens to be on that floor. Doctor comes in. I saw that doctor literally cry in the room. Literally tears pouring down his face and shaking his head and just saying to the dad, I have no answers. I have no answers, sir. You got a miracle. And so the doctor came in and depressed his tongue, said, "Say ah." The boy said, "Ah." He said, "What do you think you can eat?" "A hamburger." He looked out. I think there was a Whataburger out the window. And the doctor just turned to somebody and said, "Somebody go get this boy a hamburger and some French fries and a Coke." And they did, and they brought it in, and he ate it all. And it was completely, see, I know telling you that, there's somebody saying, "Oh, stories get warped out of shape." I know. That's why we don't tell some stories to everybody, because it's casting the things that are so valuable and precious to one in front of those who don't believe it and don't share the same value. And it's not going to make them believe it. If you choose not to believe, that's not going to make you believe. Somebody says, "We ought to tell everything good God's done." Man, that's not really going to change anybody's opinion. Just the other day, I went to visit a man who had passed away. And his son is a doctor. And the man who had died had gone through the last few months a period of time where the mind gets scrambled, and the vitals are okay, but word salad, kind of like some people having a stroke, only he hadn't had one. His mind did not put the dots together. And so when the doctor with multiple degrees comes to see his dad one day, his dad has slipped over an edge of mental cognizance. And he's trying to talk to him, well, Dad, whatever. And his dad says just words that mean nothing. It just put words together. Strong and green and tree and here, just words. And they mean nothing. And he doesn't know if the mind thinks he's saying something or not, but there is no more communication. And he knew the word for that. He told me, he said the word for that is, and he knew exactly what was wrong with his father. He knew exactly what was going on because he is a doctor with multiple degrees. And he said, this is, Danny, what they call, and he explained it. And he says to me, because he happens to know me now, not the me from 1973. He knows the me now. So he didn't mind confiding in me. He said, I did something I've never done before. I won't tell this to everybody. Don't think I'm betraying him. When he got through, I said, I'm going to share this story with somebody. And he said, feel free. And he said, I did something I've never done. He said, I know what's wrong with my dad. I know no drug will fix that. I know the devil doesn't have any power over him, but I know Jesus cast devils out and bound them. And I just thought, why not? Because of what people will say or think? Why not? And he said, I stood there by my dad's bed and I said, devil, you're a liar. And I rebuke you and I want you to get your hands off of my dad. I want him to talk. God, I want you to make his mind come together. I want you to let him be able to communicate. And he said, I bet I said bad things to the devil for 5 minutes. And I've never done that in my life. I rebuked him. I called him names. I said, Jesus wasn't worried about you. He just rebuked you and put you in your place. I'm putting you in your place. You get away from here. You leave my dad alone. You let his mind go. I know, God, that I need a miracle, and that's what I'm asking for. And he said, when I got through praying after a while, I said, Dad, I hope nothing I said was wrong or bothered you. I hope you understood. And his dad said, oh, I did, son. And he said, what? He said, I did. I appreciate the prayer. And they had a conversation. Perfect. He said to me, best conversation I've had with my dad in years. My dad and I got to talk about anything and everything. And after 30 minutes, I thought, I don't want to miss this. So I called my kids, his grandkids. I said, I want y'all to get in the car with your mom, come over here and see your grandpa right now. And he said, my family drove over and walked in, and we had a perfect conversation. And he had caught up on everything we have lost the last couple of years. And they cried, they hugged, they got in the car and left, and he slipped away. And he said, last week, the head, I would call the name, but one of the hospitals in the medical center, head of the neurological department is a good friend of this doctor. And he said, last week I called my good friend, Dr. So-and-so, head of neurology at a major hospital, you all know, in the medical center. And I said, I want to bounce something off of you. And he said, I trust her. I've known her for years. Amazing doctor. And he said, I told her, I want to bounce something off of you. You know my dad, you know his condition. He has big words I can't pronounce. And the other day I prayed for him in his room. And I just said, devil, you're a liar. You get your hands off my dad. Get out of this room. Leave us all alone. God, give me a miracle. I want my dad. And I had an hour of the most wonderful conversation. My kids came over. And I want to ask you, is that medically possible? And he said, I don't know what I was expecting. But here's what she gave me. She said, you stop that right now. You know what you're doing? You're second guessing God. I love that the head of a neurological division in the medical center would be able to say something to a man like that. You're second guessing God. You stop that right now. You're looking for me to give you answers. There are no answers. You got a miracle. You accept that. You embrace that. And you stop trying to make sense of it and put it in medical terminology. You got a miracle. This can't happen. This doesn't happen. There is no reversal, not even a temporary reversal of what's wrong with your dad. You stop. And to me, these verses were clear as a bell. You can't tell everybody that, sir. There'll be some people say, oh, bless his heart, he means well, but he's a little cuckoo. To believe God would really shine a light in your truck for 45 minutes, woohoo. Yeah, you can't tell everybody everything. But you know what you can do? Every time God performs one of his million little miracles in your life, you can understand, now I completely know what is the purpose of the grace of God. He is coating my sickness. He is covering my bitterness. He is covering my depression. He's covering my mind. He's covering my heart. He's covering the tumor. He's covering the sick. Does any of that make sense? Are those verses even coming clean? The one I read to you a minute ago, that's the one I really want you to be sure you get. The one, I'm not going to go back to it. The one that said, watch carefully lest you miss the purpose of the grace of God. Watch carefully. Here's the purpose of the grace of God. Everything that comes into your life that you think is not supposed to be there is an irritant that can cause you to become an embittered person, angry at life and angry at God. Or you can say, this is where I need the grace of God. And the grace of God will come in and put a coating on everything that hurts me so that it can't hurt me anymore. Instead of bitter, I will just be better.